I was 9 years old the first time my brother made a joke about me taking something that wasn't mine, and I still remember exactly where I was standing when he said it. We were at our grandparents' house in Clarksville for Easter Sunday. Someone had brought a basket of dinner rolls to the table, and I'd taken two before anyone else had served themselves, because I was 9 and hungry, and that is the entire story. My brother Dean, who was 15 and already fluent in the particular cruelty that gets laughed off as older sibling humor, looked across the table at our uncle and said, with perfect comic timing, classic Harper. Sees something she wants, just takes it. Everyone chuckled. My grandmother said, "Oh, Dean," in a tone that meant absolutely nothing. I put one roll back on the bread plate and did not eat the other one. It was a dinner roll. I was 9 years old. But the version of me that got filed away in my family's collective memory was settled in that moment. She's the one who takes what isn't hers. For 20 years after that, I lived very carefully around that label. I split every check down to the dollar. I returned borrowed things the same day I borrowed them. I declined gifts that seemed too large, not because I didn't want them, but because accepting felt like proving something. I built a quiet, deliberate life in Nashville, a one-bedroom in the Gulch, a job at a branding studio I was genuinely proud of, a small circle of people who knew me as exactly who I was. I had worked hard to make myself unassailable, which is another way of saying I had worked very hard to make myself invisible. Then I met Finn Mercer, and he saw me anyway. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming in East Nashville about 2.5 years ago. He was standing near the kitchen island, eating a piece of cheese off a cracker, and looking mildly amused at a conversation he was only halfway participating in. He taught AP history at a public high school in Brentwood. He had a quality of stillness that I initially read as disinterest, and eventually understood was something rarer. He simply wasn't performing for anyone in the room. When he asked what I did, he listened to the whole answer without scanning the room while I talked. When I mentioned I'd grown up in Clarksville, he asked what it had been like to leave. Not "do you miss it?" Not "why did you go?" but what leaving had felt like. I stood in that kitchen for 40 minutes longer than I'd planned. When I left, he asked if he could text me. He was 33 when we started dating. I was 27. The first few months I kept waiting for the version of him I'd eventually find that would make everything make sense in a worse way. It didn't come. He was consistent the way some people are, not because they're performing consistency, but because they don't know how to be otherwise. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered small things I mentioned in passing. He gave me space without calling the space abandonment. 14 months in, he proposed at the trailhead of a state park outside Franklin, right after we'd finished a hike neither of us had adequately prepared for. He had the ring in his jacket pocket for all 4 miles of uphill trail. He got down on one knee on a gravel path with pine needles on his jacket, and his face still flushed from the climb, and his voice was shaking slightly when he started the question. I said yes before he finished it. We set the engagement party for the first Saturday in June at his parents' house in Brentwood. His mother Ruth had been planning it for 3 weeks with the focused energy of a woman who genuinely loved a reason to set a beautiful table. I had been looking forward to it the way I had learned to look forward to things, carefully, without saying too much out loud, because I had spent enough of my life discovering that joy announced clearly is the easiest kind to take from you. I should tell you about my father. He died 4 years ago of a cardiac event on a Thursday afternoon in March. He was 61. His name was Gene Drummond, and he coached Little League for 15 years and kept a hummingbird feeder on the back porch and called me every Sunday morning until he couldn't anymore. He was a quiet man, and I loved him without complication, which is the cleanest form of love I have ever known. In the year before he died, my father changed his will. He used an estate attorney in Nashville, not the family's longtime attorney in Clarksville, and he did not tell my brother or my mother ahead of time. The change shifted the distribution of his estate to give me a slightly larger share. When the will was read after his death, Dean looked at me across the conference room table with an expression that transported me directly back to the Easter dinner and the dinner roll. She saw something she wanted and took it. What Dean did not know, because my father had told only me, was why the change had been made. In the final year of his life, my father had discovered that Dean had been quietly transferring money from our parents' joint checking account into a separate account of his own. Small amounts, regular intervals. 2 years of it before my father caught it. He had confronted Dean privately. Dean had repaid most of what he'd taken and promised to stop. My father chose not to tell my mother because he did not want her to spend the remaining years of their marriage feeling like the ground had shifted under everything she trusted. He changed the will as the only form of correction available to him that didn't require burning the family to the ground. He told me this in his living room 6 weeks before he died. He asked me not to tell Dean that he knew, and not to tell my mother at all. He said he wanted the last portion of his life to be peaceful. He was 61 years old and tired, and he wanted peace more than he wanted justice, and I understood that completely. I kept the secret through his funeral, through the estate proceedings, through Dean's cold, brittle hostility toward me that I understood the source of and could not address, through months of back and forth with attorneys until I finally accepted a settlement smaller than the will specified because I was exhausted and grieving, and I could not figure out how to tell the truth without destroying the one remaining parent I had. Dean reframed my acceptance as proof that I had known my claim was indefensible. My mother, caught between her grief and her children, chose the version of events that required the least of her. I moved forward. I told Finn that my father had passed, that the estate had been complicated, that I was not close with my brother. He held those pieces carefully and did not push. There is a particular kind of trust that grows when someone does not demand access to the rooms you are not ready to open. I was learning slowly that trust was something that could be given rather than taken. 3 weeks before the engagement party, Finn called me at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him before, careful and deliberate, the way a person sounds when they're holding something that wants to fall. He told me my brother had called him. Dean had gotten Finn's number through my mother and reached out that afternoon. He told Finn that in the months before my father died, I had manipulated a grieving, medicated man into altering his will to benefit me, that the family had documentation suggesting undue influence, that they had chosen not to pursue legal action specifically to protect me, and that they felt Finn deserved to understand the full picture of who he was choosing to marry. My mother had sent a follow-up text to Ruth the same day, gentle in tone and surgical in effect. I just hope Finn knows what he's taking on. We've always worried so much about Harper. Finn did not accuse me of anything. He just asked quietly if there was something he needed to understand. I drove to his apartment that night. I sat across from him at the kitchen table, under the overhead light that always needed to be replaced and never was, and I told him everything. My father's discovery, the money Dean had taken, the request for silence, the years I had maintained that silence as an act of love for a mother who never asked me to and never thanked me for it. The settlement, the decision to move to Nashville and build a life that was entirely my own, which had felt at the time like escape, and later like survival, and only recently had started to feel like something I might be allowed to simply call a life. When I finished, Finn was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and set his hand over mine, and he said, "That sounds like an incredibly exhausting thing to carry by yourself for this long." Not, "I believe you." Not, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Not, "I need some time to think about this." He named the weight of it first before anything else. That was the man I was marrying. But I knew, sitting in that kitchen, that Finn's goodness wasn't enough to undo what Dean had planted. Dean had contacted him 3 weeks before an event that would put both families in the same room together for the first time. He had timed it precisely. A lie told at the right moment, to the right ears, before anyone has context or footing, has a way of staying even after it's been answered. Dean had spent 20 years refining this particular skill. He knew exactly what a seed of doubt, planted that close to something important, could do to the soil around it. What he could not have known was that the estate law firm he had used during the proceedings employed a paralegal named Violet Crow, and that Violet had sat inside that process and watched it, and been troubled by what she saw, and had kept copies of documents she never found the right moment to do anything with, until she heard, through a mutual professional contact in Nashville's commercial real estate community, that Dean was now telling a new story about me to new people. She found me on LinkedIn 4 days before the party. Her message was 7 sentences, plainly written. She said she had worked on the estate file. She said she had heard what my brother was telling people. She said she had documents she thought I should see before the party. She asked if we could meet. We met at a coffee shop on Charlotte Avenue on a Thursday morning. She brought a folder. I ordered a coffee and did not drink it. Inside were printed email chains from the estate proceedings. In one, written 11 days after my father died, Dean had contacted the estate attorney and suggested the firm formally document their concerns about the will change, citing my father's age, his cardiac medications, his grief, as potential evidence of undue influence. The attorney had replied in an internal email, one not intended to reach Dean, flagging to a colleague that there was no clinical or evidentiary basis for the client's characterization, and recommending they decline to pursue the framing. Attached to the file was the attorney's own handwritten note, the kind attorneys write to themselves for their own records. Brother appears to be directing narrative. Advise caution liability. There was a draft letter, never sent, from the estate firm recommending that I retain independent legal counsel, prepared during the months of negotiation and withheld because the settlement concluded before it was finalized. And at the bottom of the folder, printed on plain paper, an email sent 3 weeks ago. Dean had written to a professional contact in Nashville, a man in commercial real estate, someone I had never met, asking him to support the family's account of events if anyone from Finn Mercer's circle makes inquiries about Harper's past. The contact had not responded to Dean. He had forwarded the email directly to Violet, with a 2-line note. I don't want any part of this, thought you should know. I sat in that booth with the documents spread in front of me, and I felt something very specific. Not the hot rush of anger, but something older and quieter and more complete. It was the feeling of having proof of something you have known your entire adult life, and could never say out loud without sounding exactly like what you'd been accused of being. I called Finn that evening and told him what I had. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked, simply, "What do you want to do with it?" I had been waiting my whole life for someone to ask me that question, instead of answering it for me. The Saturday of the engagement party was warm and golden, the way June evenings in Tennessee can be when the storms hold off. That low amber light that comes through the trees an hour before dusk, the kind that makes everything look slightly more beautiful than it does in the honest brightness of noon. Ruth had strung white lights across the entire backyard and set small round tables with pale linen and low centerpieces of white garden roses and eucalyptus that she'd arranged herself the day before. A long table ran along the back fence with food, and a cooler filled with drinks. Near the side gate, 2 students from Belmont University played string quartet pieces, with the focused, professionally neutral expressions of people being paid to be background. I stood at the edge of the yard when I arrived, and let myself have 30 seconds of it, just to look. Finn's father, Jim, a retired contractor who called everyone friend, regardless of whether he'd met them before, was shaking hands near the entrance. Our friends from Nashville were filling in across the yard, people who knew us together and thought well of us and had no idea what the last 3 weeks had felt like inside our apartment. My brother and my mother arrived at 6:45. My mother was wearing a pale blue dress and the expression she reserved for public occasions, pleasant, composed, performing a warmth that I had spent most of my childhood mistaking for the real thing. Dean worked the periphery of the yard, laughing with people he'd just met, looking like exactly what he had practiced being for 35 years. The reasonable one, the stable one, the one who worried about his sister. I had not spoken to either of them since the night Finn called me. At 7:15, Violet Crow walked through the gate. I had not invited her. Finn had never met her. She was 37, composed and unhurried, with a manila folder tucked under her arm and the bearing of someone who had made a significant decision and was at peace with it. She found me near the food table, and we stepped to the side of the yard together, to the section near the fence where the string lights ended, and the light was softer and the quartet's music covered our voices. Finn appeared beside me without being asked. He did that, moved into proximity when he sensed I needed company without needing to explain it. I had not fully understood until the last 3 weeks how rare that quality was. I looked across the yard. My brother was standing near the drinks cooler, laughing at something. My mother had moved to speak with Ruth, her face warm and open, the performance of a woman with nothing to hide. I took the folder from Violet. I walked across the yard. I set the folder on the table in front of my brother and my mother. Around us, both families, our friends, the warm light, the string quartet playing something unhurried and calm. Finn stood beside me. Violet had moved to the edge of the gathering. Ruth, I noticed, had stepped slightly closer. I did not raise my voice. I had spent too many years learning that raising my voice in rooms like this cost me everything and changed nothing. I spoke clearly and without performance. I told them what was in the folder. I said that Dean had contacted Finn 3 weeks ago with a version of events he had constructed, and that the documents in front of him showed the estate attorney had found no basis for the undue influence claim Dean had tried to build. I said the attorney had noted Dean's interference in the file. I said that 3 weeks ago, Dean had reached out to a professional contact in Nashville, asking that person to corroborate a story. And that contact had declined and had instead forwarded the email to the person who prepared these documents. I set the email on top of the stack. I said I kept quiet about what our father told me because he asked me to. I kept quiet about the estate because I believed silence was a form of protection. I am done keeping quiet. Dean's jaw moved without producing a sound. He looked at the folder, he looked at me, he looked at Finn, he looked back at the table. My mother looked at the pale linen. The yard went still. The quartet, either by perfect accident or by the instinct of people trained to read rooms, let the phrase they were playing finish and did not immediately begin another. Finn said, in a voice that was entirely level, "I think it would be best if you both left." Jim said, from where he was standing near the gate, "Yeah, I'd agree with that." Ruth said quietly and without any hesitation, "Yes, please." My mother picked up her purse from the table. She walked toward the gate without looking at me. Dean followed 2 steps behind her, and he did not speak, and for the first time in my living memory, he looked precisely like what he was. A man who had spent 20 years building a story in rooms where I couldn't answer and had run out of room to operate. The gate closed. The yard was still for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Finn's cousin Blythe, who had driven up from Chattanooga and who I had met exactly twice before this evening, raised her glass and said, in a voice that clearly across the whole yard, "To Harper." Someone began to clap, then more joined. Jim raised his glass without a word. Ruth touched my arm once briefly, and it was enough. Violet stayed for the party. She ate dinner at the table nearest the fence and talked with a group of our Nashville friends, and did not ask for anything from the evening beyond being there. At some point, she caught my eye from across the yard and gave me a small, unhurried nod. I gave one back. I stood in that backyard under the string lights, with Finn's hand in mine, and I let it settle. The warmth, the laughter, the sound of people who had chosen to be there. We married 6 weeks later on a Saturday morning in mid-August at a botanical garden in Franklin. 41 guests, white oak trees and soft white light, and wooden chairs set in neat rows on the grass. Everything was simple and honest and completely ours. Neither my brother nor my mother were there. I had made that decision the Sunday morning after the engagement party, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a clarity I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. I wrote them each a letter, not long, not emotional, just factual. I told them I was not pursuing legal action. I told them I did not intend to maintain contact going forward. I told them I wished them no specific harm. I mailed both letters on the same day and went for a long walk through the neighborhood and noticed that the ground under my feet felt exactly like ground. Solid, ordinary, mine. At the ceremony, Finn stood under the oak tree with his note card shaking slightly in his hand. He had written his vows himself and folded the card so many times in the weeks before that the paper had softened at the crease. His voice broke on the second sentence. He laughed at himself for it, composed himself, and kept going. I stood there with my face warm and let him finish entirely before I cried through mine. Violet was at a table near the back of the reception with a small group of our friends. At some point, during the dancing, when the light had gone gold through the garden and the evening had turned easy, I looked across the room. She raised her glass of sparkling water toward me. I raised mine back. It was a small moment. It did not need to be anything larger. I am Harper Mercer. I am 29 years old. I spent most of those years believing that the only way to be safe in my family was to make myself small enough that there was nothing left to call a taking. I watched my words. I returned borrowed things. I put the second roll back and did not eat the one I kept. I perfected the performance of a person who never wanted anything she wasn't already owed. Here's what I know now that I did not know then. Shrinking is not the same as surviving. Silence is not the same as peace. I spent a long time confusing the two, and the cost of that confusion was high in ways I am still quietly calculating. The day I stopped was not the moment I set a folder on a linen tablecloth in front of people who had never defended me. It was the morning after, alone with my coffee, when I picked up a pen and wrote 2 letters that did not apologize for anything, and then went for a walk, and the air was ordinary, and the street was quiet, and nothing collapsed. There are people who leave when you stop performing for them, and then there are people who were never truly there. They were simply present, occupying the space that your performance created, feeding on your careful smallness. The second kind are harder to identify, because they look like family. They come to your engagement party in pale blue dresses, and they shake hands with people they have never met, and they laugh at things you cannot hear. And for a moment, standing in a beautiful backyard full of light, you almost convince yourself it was a misunderstanding. It was not a misunderstanding. But sometimes, if you are very fortunate and if you have built something real enough to be worth protecting, someone walks through a gate carrying proof, and the people you thought were permanent turn out to be exactly as temporary as they always were. They pick up their purses and walk out, and the gate closes, and the music continues, and someone you barely know raises a glass in your direction. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever stood in a room where someone rewrote your history and no one corrected them, I want you to tell you that the engagement party is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is precisely where your real life begins. If this moved you, please subscribe to Quiet Revenge Tales. Every story we tell here is for someone who needed to hear it today. Subscribe, turn on your notifications, and come back for the next one. The best chapters are always still ahead.